I want to welcome all of you to this video Drasha. I hope all of you are feeling well and staying safe. I'll just remind you that we did post a video last Shabbos or last Friday. If you haven't taken a look at that, you might want to do so. This week's Drasha is really a continuation from last week, so you may want to take a look at that one first. What I am speaking about is the Passover Haggadah. It's always been my practice in the weeks before Passover, when I'm in Peoria, to speak about the Haggadah, to give you some food for thought, as I've called it, for the Seder, so that you will have some commentary, some explanations of the Haggadah that you can perhaps discuss and talk about at your Seder. So I want to start this week with a story that is found in the Haggadah. And it's a story of 5 rabbis. It says that once Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yehoshua, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Tarfon were at their Seder in Bnei Brak, and they spent the whole night discussing the Exodus from Egypt until their students came in the morning and said, "It is time for the morning Shema." So this story is brought as an illustration of a point that was made at the end of the last paragraph, at the paragraph just prior to this story in the Haggadah, where it had said, anyone who speaks a lot, anybody who extends the discussion of the Exodus from Egypt, that is praiseworthy. The idea is that at our Seders we should be taking time to discuss, to explain, to ask questions, to really expound upon the Exodus from Egypt. And then this story is brought of these 5 rabbis who were so involved in discussing the Exodus that they spent all night long, and they actually had to be reminded in the morning that it was time for the morning prayers. Now, these 5 rabbis were among the most prominent rabbis of the Mishnah. Remember, we're talking about a historical period of the 1st and 2nd centuries. These rabbis lived at the end of the 1st century and the beginning of the 2nd, and they are among really the most prominent rabbis from the Mishnah. And the fact that these great scholars spent all night discussing the Exodus from Egypt is meant to be a model for us of this idea that anyone who extends, who speaks at length about the Seder, that is praiseworthy. But there's another lesson that we learn from this story. But for this, we need to know a little bit about these 5 rabbis. Who were they? So 4 of these rabbis were actually the descendants of the tribe of Levi. They were Levites. And one of them, Rabbi Akiva, was a descendant of converts. Now, what's significant about this? Well, there is actually a tradition that the Levites were not enslaved in Egypt. So hence, for those 4 rabbis to say, we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, well, really, their forebears were not slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. And the same for Rabbi Akiva, since he was the child of converts, for him to say, our fathers were slaves to, or we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, that is not really true. His forebears were not slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. So the point that's being made here is that all Jews should feel part of the Jewish people. And it doesn't matter whether historically we could say, well, were your ancestors actually enslaved to Pharaoh in Egypt or not? Because all 5 of these rabbis, none of their ancestors were slaves in Egypt. But as Jews, as part of the Jewish people, we feel that this is our experience. we need to each feel personally as if we were slaves in Egypt. And so that point is made very strongly here by the fact that the 5 rabbis who are held up as examples of spending all night talking about the Exodus from Egypt, that actually none of them were the descendants of people, of Jews who had been enslaved. But the idea is to feel yourself a part of the Jewish people. That's ultimately the wicked son, the Drasha, right? Why is he rebuked? It says because he removes himself from the klal, from the generality of the Jewish people. He removes himself. That's what makes him a Drasha. That's what makes him the bad, the wicked son. And so the whole point of this story is to emphasize the fact that all Jews should feel as if they were slaves in Egypt. And this is particularly important today, I think, for people who are converts to Judaism or who are the children of converts. And that is, no one should say, well, because I am a convert, so really I can't say, we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. No, quite the contrary. Converts do say we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. And this question came up in other contexts as well. We know that in the Shemona Esrei, in the daily prayer that we say 3 times a day, it begins with the words, "Blessed are you, O Lord our God, God of our fathers, God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob." Well, the question came up already a very long time ago. Should a convert say those words? God of our fathers, right? So the Rambam, Maimonides, answered this question. He said, yes, converts should say God of our fathers, because when you convert to Judaism, then Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob become your fathers. They are the progenitors of the Jewish people. A convert is part of the Jewish people, and hence Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are the fathers of all Jews, including converts. By the way, there's another interesting dimension to this as well, and that is there is a concept that all Jews were present at Mount Sinai. Again, it's kind of difficult to understand what does that exactly mean, what all Jews were present at Mount Sinai, but there is such a concept, and the fact is that includes converts. People who have converted to Judaism, they also were present at Mount Sinai. So again, this is a point that is made by what seems to just be a kind of very simple story in the Haggadah. If we delve into it a little bit, we see that there's really a very important message there. The next piece that I want to deal with is a line in the Haggadah that every year I stop at this point in the Seder and I really speak about this because I think it is so important. I think it really is the essence of what the Seder is about. And the Haggadah says, in every generation, each person is obligated to feel as if he or she had personally gone out of Egypt. That's really what the Seder is about. The Seder is about not simply remembering some distant historical event. It's not simply that we say, 3,000 years ago, a great historical event happened to our ancestors. That's not the point. The point is to say, this is my experience. I was there. I was part of the Exodus from Egypt. Now, if we compare that to some other commemorations of events, I think we see an important difference. And I want to make this example. I will tell you that every year on December 7th, we make a mention of the fact that that's Pearl Harbor Day. We generally tend to talk about it at the dinner table. December 7th is Pearl Harbor Day. Very important event. The event that ultimately brought the United States into World War II. And we think about the tremendous sacrifice that was made, the hundreds of thousands of American soldiers who perished in the attempt to defeat Nazism in Europe. And so it's a very important event. Also, I can tell you that on June 6th, D-Day, we also, I like to mention that as well. every year. It's a very, very important event. That's the beginning of the beginning of the defeat of the Nazis in Europe. And again, as Jews, we certainly need to see the importance of these events. Ultimately, the defeat of the Nazis led to the liberation of the concentration camps, and so those who had survived were able to be liberated. Those are very important historical events. We should remember them. We should recognize their importance. But I don't say to myself, I was at Pearl Harbor. I was at D-Day. I mean, the fact is that would be really quite inappropriate. I was not there. I'm remembering an important historical event. Here, though, with Passover and the Seder, the goal is precisely to say, this is my historical experience. I was there. Every Jew should feel as if he or she had personally gone out of Egypt. So I think there's an important difference here, and we should really always keep this in mind. We're not simply remembering some distant historical event and saying, well, look, 3,000 years ago, this great event happened to our ancestors. No, it needs to be part of our personal experience. And that's why I think the Seder is really such a brilliant pedagogic instrument, because the idea of using foods as symbols, and so we actually eat these symbols during the Seder, that's a way of internalizing. It literally is a way of internalizing the lessons and the experiences and the ideas of Passover. So when we eat the matzah, when we eat the maror, the bitter herbs, when we eat the charoset, the mixture of fruit and nuts that is symbolic of the mortar that was used by our people when they built the things that they built for Pharaoh. The fact that these foods are literally consumed, I think is a very, very ingenious idea. And it really is an idea of internalizing this experience, which is what the Seder is all about. At the end of the Seder, we should feel as if somehow this is our historical experience, not simply the historical experience of Jews a long time ago. And finally, I wanted to just talk about something perhaps a little bit lighter, and that is at the end of the Seder, there are a number of songs. And I don't know whether everyone sings these songs at the Seder or not. I can tell you in our house, we've always sung all these songs. It's almost the climax of the Seder for us. We love singing these songs. And there's a couple of interesting ones that I just want to point out to you. The one is a kind of counting song. You know, I think probably it's a very common thing in many cultures to have counting songs. So in the Haggadah, we have a song that goes something like this in translation. You know, who knows one? I know one. One is Hashem. One is the Kadosh Baruch Hu. One is God. Who knows two? I know two. Two are the tablets that Moses brought down from Mount Sinai. Who knows three? I know three. Three are the fathers, right? Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Who knows four? I know four. Four are the mothers. Sarah, Rebecca, Leah, and Rachel. And so on and so forth. It goes through the numbers. Again, this is a very typical kind of children's song, a number song. But here in the Haggadah, we see that this is a Jewish counting song, and one in which each of the numbers is associated with some important thing from Jewish life and Jewish culture. So that 5 is, of course, the 5 books of Moses. 6 are the 6 orders of the Mishnah. 7 are the days of the week that lead up to the Sabbath. 8 are the 8 days of circumcision. So it really is a very, very good song for children particularly to learn some of these concepts. but it's a good example also of how the Haggadah contains in it something that is not really a uniquely Jewish idea, a counting song, but this is a uniquely Jewish version of a counting song. The other song at the end of the Haggadah is Haggadah. Haggadah, Haggadah, which means one goat. And again, this is a song which I'm sure many cultures have songs of this type. In English, this is The Old Lady Who Swallowed the Fly. It starts off with one goat, and then you have the cat ate the goat, and then the dog bit the cat, and then the stick beat the dog, and the fire burnt the stick, and the water put out the fire, and so on and so forth, until you finally get to the last two parts of this, which is that the Malach Hamavis kills the butcher, and ultimately the Kadosh Baruch Hu, God, kills the Malach Hamavis. So that, again, what we have here is an example of a song which is not uniquely Jewish. It's a kind of very typical folk song, but this is a Jewish version of one. And ultimately, it does contain a lesson in it. Because the lesson of this is that all of these events, all of these seemingly kind of trivial events, right? That the cat ate the goat and the dog bit the cat and so on and so forth. At the end of all of this is what? It's God. And the idea is that ultimately God, is what is behind all the events that we see in the world. And so that is the message of this Jewish version of this, I think, probably very typical folk song. So I hope with these thoughts in mind, you will have a very enjoyable Seder. There's no question, we can say, why is this year different than all other years? This year is going to be a very different kind of Passover. Certainly, it is very difficult to observe a holiday with all of these restrictions in place. But you know what? We will get through it. We will observe Passover. And I will just remind you, the most important thing is to stay safe. We all want to be healthy, and we also need to worry about other people. And so it's very important that we follow the rules. And we'll get through. Look, we'll have Passover. We'll get through this, and God willing, next year we'll be back to a regular Passover and a regular Seder. But for the time being, please stay safe. So I want to wish everyone a good Shabbos and a happy Passover.